Hello, my name is Paul Kaplan, and I'm the Vice President of Medical Device Epidemiology and Real-World Data Sciences for Johnson & Johnson. The topic of my talk today is real-world evidence for label expansions of medical devices approved by regulatory authorities, lessons from the U.S. National Evaluation System for Health Technology, or NEST, and the Chinese BOAO Real-World Evidence Initiative. And I'd like to thank the conference organizers for the opportunity to speak to you today at this important conference, and also to apologize that I can't be there in person this year. That's why I'm presenting virtually, but I hope to be with you perhaps at the next conference next year. By way of disclosure, the opinions expressed are those of an individual employee of Johnson & Johnson and not those of Johnson & Johnson, the company. So as a starting point, I'd like to look at a study that was commissioned by the FDA and was done by Harvard School of Public Health to understand the accuracy of real-world evidence. And what they did was because RCTs, randomized clinical trials, considered the gold standard, they wanted to look at how well observational comparative database studies emulate or have concordance with the randomized clinical trials. So they took 32 randomized clinical trials. Those were considered the gold standard. They conducted 32 observational non-randomized database studies and compared the agreement of the pairs, the 32 pairs. What they found was of the 32 studies, the Pearson correlation coefficient for the effect size, whether that was the hazard ratio or relative risk, however the effect was measured, the Pearson correlation coefficient was 0.82, which, as you know, is a very high correlation. And when they looked at the concordance of statistical significance in the pairs, in other words, if both studies statistically significant, or did both studies show a non-statistical significant association, there was concordance for 75% of the 32 pairs. However, the big take-home from this study I found was that the most strongest determinant of whether the observational study, the real-world evidence study, was what had concordance with the RCT, had to do with whether the real-world evidence could emulate the RCT. So the investigators divided the studies into those that there was close emulation and those where there was weaker emulation. And the closer emulation had a correlation of 0.93 and a statistically significant concordance of 94%, very, very similar. Whereas for weaker emulation studies, it was quite a lot weaker. So this suggests that real-world evidence can be accurate if it is carefully the information that's necessary to match the RCT or to match the research question is available. Now, the goal of real-world evidence, as I see it, is getting the right medical device to the right patient at the right time, using the right technique. And as we mentioned earlier, clinical trial evidence is the gold standard, but it has significant gaps in terms of, can you do the clinical trials? How much does it cost? Can you measure the things? And do you have the representative population in the clinical trials? So real-world evidence is needed to answer important questions for treating patients. Reliable, fit-for-purpose real-world evidence is much better than no evidence or eminence-based evidence, which is relying on expert physicians to determine what the best course of clinical practice is. Real-world evidence is working for post-approval studies and for some label extensions, and I'll show 4 label extensions in my talk today. However, determining the level of evidence that's needed for regulatory decisions is an evolving science in terms of the data quality, study methodology, and whether the results are fit for purpose to answer the research question. So of the 4 regulatory approvals I'll show, this is the first one using real-world evidence. This is a Chinese NMPA approval of a cataract surgery system via the BOAO real-world evidence pilot. This is the intended use of this laser system is to guide the delivery of accurate laser incisions for cataract surgery, with the goal of improving the accuracy of the patient vision after the cataract surgery. Now, this product was approved in the EU in 2011 and subsequently in the USA in 2012, and then approved in other markets. And it was approved in China in January 2021 through the BOAO real-world evidence pathway. The goal of the BOAO real-world evidence study was to provide supplemental evidence to existing worldwide clinical trial, clinical literature, and pharmacovigilance evidence to address ethnic differences. What we learned from this was that the BOAO pilot was a unique opportunity for both for China and worldwide in terms of how to use real-world evidence. There were clear operational efficiencies in terms of the reduction in study time and acceleration of innovative product registrations. We also learned that considering the totality of evidence is important, that collaboration is essential. We needed partnership between the hospital, the PI, the study staff, and strong support from the local government and CMDE, and thank you very much for that support, as well as intercompany coordination and communication. So a big lesson here is that real-world evidence is a team sport if we are to be successful. Now, I'd like to turn to 3 label expansions by the FDA using real-world evidence. The first is, and I believe this was the first label extension by FDA CDRH using real-world evidence from a registry. So the first real-world label extension used a registry. This particular study was looking at transcatheter aortic valve replacement as an alternative to open heart surgery or surgical valve replacement. And the product had initially been approved in high-risk patients based on a clinical trial. The question, and in that clinical trial, there was a 82% reduction in the mortality associated with open heart surgery. The question was, should the label be extended to intermediate risk patients? And for the intermediate risk patients, there was good 30-day clinical outcomes data, but there was no longer-term outcome data in order to look at post-surgical mortality. So what was needed was that longer-term 1-year follow-up for patients. And in the study, the registry was used as a treatment group in a multi-center perspective observational registry with 963 intermediate risk patients. And the control group was from a clinical study, and this was an external control from a clinical trial with 747 intermediate risk patients who got open heart surgery. And then propensity scores were used to balance patient, surgeon, and hospital characteristics. This found that the study results show that the TAVR was superior to surgical valve replacement in terms of reducing post-surgical mortality. The evidence was published in Lancet in 2016, and also in 2016, FDA extended the label to intermediate risk patients. The FDA also in 2016 created a national evaluation system for health technology. The pioneer for this was the director of CDRH, Dr. Jeffrey Shuren. And here the goal was to create a public-private partnership to advance the innovation in medical devices by accessing real-world data and real-world evidence to inform critical decision-making. Initially, it had funding from FDA, but then also industry funding was added in 2017, and the program continues to this day with joint FDA and industry funding. The research network consists of 19 network collaborators with 225 million patient records, as well as a methods subcommittee designed to develop a playbook for medical device studies, both observational and interventional, as well as safety signal detection, and a data quality subcommittee that's designed to for standards for designing, submitting, executing, and interpreting real-world evidence studies to ensure the reliability, reproducibility, and transparency of real-world data. I'm the co-chair of the data quality subcommittee with a member from FDA. Now, I'd like to turn to a label extension study that used electronic health record databases rather than a registry, like the earlier TAVR example. And this was a NIST test case that then led to a label extension. This was conducted by J&J in collaboration with Mayo Clinic and Mercy Health and Yale New Haven. The device of interest was J&J Bison Webster's Thermocool Smart Touch catheter, I'll refer to that ST, compared to Thermocool Smart Touch Surround Flow STSF catheter. Now, the technical difference, the new technology between these two catheters, is that the older catheter had a 6-hole irrigation. You can see that over here. This meant that it wasn't very effective in cooling the tip, as effective as it could be. And it also had to release a lot of fluid to release the tip, which then put more strain on the heart by having more fluid. In contrast, the newer technology has 56 holes that cools the tip better, which allows the electrophysiologist to conduct the ablation for pulmonary vein isolation more effectively without having to worry about overheating the tissue and getting charring of the tissue. Now, the newer catheter got approval for a more advanced stage of atrial fibrillation called persistent atrial fibrillation based on a clinical trial. The older catheter was approved for paroxysmal atrial fibrillation based on a clinical trial, but not for the more advanced stage of persistent atrial fibrillation. And it's recognized that it's harder to treat persistent atrial fibrillation by cardiac ablation. So the target was to get a persistent atrial fibrillation label extension for the Smart Touch catheter. Now, to do this, we designed a study in collaboration with Mercy, Mayo, and Yale, where the objective was to compare the ST catheter to the STSF catheter in terms of non-inferiority. And we used a retrospective comparative cohort study comparing the two catheters using propensity scores to balance the two cohorts in terms of their patient, hospital, and surgeon characteristics. For the study, there were 1,450 patients from Mercy or Mayo Clinic in the US, and between the years of 2014 and 2021. And we only used EHR data for the study. We did, however, identify the devices, the unique devices from the hospital systems, supply chain systems. And once we identified which, from the supply chain systems, which device was used, that was then linked to the EHR. Now, the primary safety endpoint was a composite safety endpoint, and it was determined by physician chart review. However, to reduce the workload of the physician chart review, we created an algorithm to flag patients if for chart review to check whether they experience the composite safety outcome. So the algorithm by which we flag patients was by ICD-9 diagnosis and procedure codes, hospitalizations of greater than 48 hours, hospitalizations occurring subsequent to the ablation within 30 days, and then length of stay being greater than 48 hours. Now, the effectiveness endpoints were identified by ICD-10 codes that had high positive predictive values versus clinician chart review. And the study protocol and statistical analysis plan we discussed extensively with FDA through Q submissions, and we incorporated FDA feedback. We posted the protocol and the SEP publicly in a registry shown over here, the NCEP registry. And each healthcare system analyzed their own data to preserve patient privacy. And for that, we used a common data model so that the analysis could be similar at Yale and Mayo. In terms of data quality, one of the things we checked was the completeness of patient follow-up in the two healthcare systems. And by 90 days, there was at least 89% follow-up of patients in Mayo Clinic, and in Mercy, it was 94%. In terms of the positive predictor value of the code-based algorithms, to define the cohort, the persistent atrial fibrillation cohort, we found that the codes that we used were 89%, has a positive predictor value of 89% compared to a chart review by an expert physician. Likewise, the endpoints that we used for effectiveness had a positive predictor values of around 90 to 95%, even 100% for rehospitalization for heart failure. In general, a positive predictor value of 80% is considered excellent. So these were very good, excellent positive predictor values. Now, this shows the primary safety results of the composite endpoint, which consists of 14 endpoints, which are listed over here. And as you can see, the data was analyzed separately for Mercy and Mayo. We balanced the cohorts, the ST and STSF cohorts by propensity score balancing within each healthcare system. And the cumulative incidence for the safety endpoint was 4.4% for the ST catheter, the study catheter, 3.1% for the control catheter for risk difference of 1.3%, For Mayo Clinic, the risk difference was minus 3.8%. When we took the weighted average of these two, it came out to 0.5%. The 90% confidence intervals were from minus 2.6% to 3.5%. The non-inferiority margin was set that the 90% upper confidence interval should be less than the expected rate of the safety event, which was 7%. So this 3.5% was below 7%, leading to a p-value compared to the non-inferiority margin of 0.0002. And in conclusion, the study met the safety endpoint rate between ST and STSF groups was not inferior and met the pre-specified criteria for label extension. Next, I'll turn to effectiveness results. And here, the effectiveness endpoint was 3 clinical events: reablation, rehospitalization for atrial tachyarrhythmia, and electrocardioversion for atrial tachyarrhythmia. What these 3 endpoints are measuring is that the atrial fibrillation didn't get cured, so the patient had to go back in for further treatment, another ablation, another hospitalization, another cardioversion. And all of these results were published in JAMA Network Open at this reference here. There's a link in the slides. The risk difference for the effectiveness endpoint was minus 5.2% in Mercy, suggesting that the study catheter had a lower rate of effectiveness of recurrence than the control catheter. And in Mayo Clinic, it was 3.1%. When we took the weighted average, it was minus 1.8%. With no statistically significant difference between them. So this was the first ever FDA approval of a label expansion based solely on comparative effectiveness real-world evidence study from EHR, electronic health record databases. And the FDA commented on this in their weekly news report. This was also the first and to date the only one of the 21 test cases funded by NEST to receive FDA approval of label expansion. NEST is currently undergoing another round of label extensions funding. These will only funding projects that have a high rate of a label extension approval within a year. Extensions such as this benefit patients in advanced regulatory science because it captures experience of patients and surgeons in clinical trial practice and uses this for regulatory decisions. Now, the example that we used for the NEST study was something that wasn't of very, very important business need to the company. It was of moderate business need. Why? Because we didn't want to put a very important business need into an exploratory program like NEST. But from the NEST study work with FDA, we got to learn what was considered fit for purpose by FDA, and then to use that for other label extensions that were of business critical need for the company. So our next label extension was a label change that affected 8 medical devices altogether. And for this, we combined registry data and comparative electronic health record data from the Mercy healthcare system, which is part of the previous label extension, the NEST label extension. And what the goal of this label extension change was that to show that the label for cardiac ablation required fluoroscopy or X-ray to be used for navigation in order to ensure safety. However, and effectiveness. However, the use of intracardiac echocardiography, which is a very sophisticated form of ultrasound, has really developed in terms of navigation and has replaced fluoroscopy for the most part. So the label change was to compare patients who were ablated using 0 or low fluoroscopy in the Mercy study that was defined as 2 or less minutes, compared to conventional fluoroscopy workflow, which is 3 or greater minutes. And the incidence of the composite safety endpoint was 0.8% versus 0.31% for a risk difference of 0.49%. With no statistically significant difference and met the non-inferiority margin. And based on this, as well as very similar data from the registry, the label was changed to allow either fluoroscopy or intracardiac echocardiography or ultrasound to be used. Now, I've talked about 4 label extensions. I didn't want to leave this presentation without just mentioning how useful electronic health record database studies can be for post-marketing surveillance. So this is a post-marketing, FDA required a post-approval study for the Thermocool STSF after it got its label extension for persistent AFib based on the clinical trial. But the FDA wanted to check that that this was safe and effective, and also to explore whether there was a difference in safety rates between men and women and effectiveness rates between men and women. They required us to enroll 350 patients and follow them for 36 months, and we had to have enrolled the 350 patients within 2 years. So we asked FDA if we could use the Mercy electronic health record data and with the supply chain to identify specific devices, and they agreed. So we conducted a single-arm retrospective observational cohort study using pre-specified performance goals of 350 persistent AFib patients, including 100 women. Within the 2 years that we had to enroll patients, we had enrolled 549 patients, and we've enrolled substantially more in subsequently. So we far exceeded the enrollment goal. But more importantly, within 18 months, we had 330 subjects, and a lot of those already had 1 year follow-up. So we got a very quick assessment of whether there was any safety or performance problems with the product, much quicker than we would have done in a clinical trial that would have cost a lot more money, but would have not have been not have reflected the safety and effectiveness as used in actual clinical practice, because it would have been in more of a clinical trial with the top hospitals and top surgeons. So just pointing out how important electronic health record data can be used for post-approval safety and effectiveness evaluations as an alternative to more expensive and longer clinical studies that don't get the answer as quickly or as in a diverse population. Now, I also didn't want to leave this talk without the mention of large administrative claims in electronic health record databases. Why? Because so many of these databases are occurring, particularly in the US, but also we're seeing in Japan, Korea, China through hospitals, and UK, where huge databases of 100, 120, sometimes 300 million patients that can be followed and used for studies. There's the US government's Medicare database, there's the Japanese government's MDV, Samsung in Korea, hospitals have partnered with the Korean government to get death outcomes. And in the UK, the UK government maintains a hospital episode statistic that can be combined with the physician record database so that you can measure what happens in the physician's office, but also then measure longitudinal hospitalizations through the government system. And also the US government has linked the Medicare insurance database with the SEER cancer registry, so we can follow people for their treatment in Medicare and then look for their hospital outcomes and cancer outcomes in the SEER. These are a database we use a lot for medical devices. It's a premier hospital database, which captures about 25% of the hospitalizations in the US. Tremendously valuable databases that can be used to get a lot of information about products. I just wanted to show one example of that, and particularly just coming back to this intracardiac echocardiography imaging for cardiac ablation for catheter navigation. This is a study in which we looked at complications and 12-month healthcare utilization using a large claims database, and we compared the patients with atrial fibrillation who underwent catheter ablation with versus without the ICE, the ultrasound echocardiography. And what we found is that it's shown in this forest plot that there was a 50% reduction in the risk of complications when ICE was used, and a 36% lower risk of 12-month repeat ablation. So in conclusion, FDA's NEST program and NMPA's BOAO real-world evidence initiative have helped to convene talented researchers, leading healthcare research systems, and industry researchers to solve some of the most important basic problems and obstacles for further use of real-world evidence for regulatory decisions. And I would really encourage regulators to really continue this. I think it's an incredibly helpful initiative to advance the use of real-world evidence research. And why is this important? Because rigorous real-world evidence can be enormously informative about medical device safety, effectiveness, and quality, and thereby ultimately to help patients globally to have better health and healthcare. And also the first label extension for medical device using data from usual clinical practice captured in electronic health records provides a path for future innovation to improve patient care and regulatory science. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, please email me, and I would love to have a dialogue with you and answer any questions you have. Thank you.